Okay, I think now is a great time to get started. Hello and welcome everyone to today's presentation of what to consider when building an IDP, brought to you by Harness and D-Zone. Internal developer portals, or IDPs, are reshaping the developer experience by providing centralized access to resources, automated workflows, and comprehensive service catalogs. IDPs can help reduce developer friction and increase productivity. But getting started in building an IDP is the hardest part and often the most critical. Today, we aim to set you on the right path towards a successful IDP implementation with the proper resources and education. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm your host, Katie Boboso, and I am very excited to be here. And in a moment, I'll be joined by Dan Gordon, Principal Product Marketing Manager at Harness. A quick note just before we get started, feel free to use the chat feature that you see on your screen throughout today's presentation to comment or ask questions, because we will be having a live Q&A session following today's presentation. Now, please join me in welcoming Dan Gordon. Hi, Dan. Welcome. Dan, you might be on mute. I apologize.
My bad.
That's how you know it's live, folks. That's how you know it's live.
That button. Apologies for that. Hi, Katie. Hi, everyone. We'll try this again. Thanks for the intro.
Thank you so much for being here, Dan.
Absolutely.
Happy to have you. Happy to have you. Why don't you get us started by telling us a bit about yourself? Let's hear about your professional background and, of course, your role at Harness.
Yeah, absolutely. So at Harness, I'm working with the product marketing department. I'm an advocate for developer experience, which encompasses internal developer portals and many other things. And I got there from a long time in the DevOps space, before they were calling it DevOps, as a developer, as an operations person, system architect, and grew up through the ranks there. Basically in the trenches, seeing the pain that can be caused when teams aren't aligned and when everyone's not using the best tools that they can and using the best processes that they can. Those nights in the war room and sitting up all weekend trying to solve the problem, burning out. Those are all real things that I focus on now, trying to help everyone avoid. So that's my passion there.
Thank you so much for that background, Dan. Why don't I hand the reins over to you and let you take it away?
Great, thank you. Okay, so this is what to consider when building an IDP, that is in internal developer portal. I'd like us to actually start with a poll. If we could get that poll up, just to kind of get a sense where everyone's coming from. I know it might take a minute to read it. Looking for where are your challenges in developer experience and productivity? Is it too much time trying to get services up and running? Too much time getting developers up and running? Way too much time watching the ticket queues go back and forth, bouncing tickets back and forth to get something done that should be automated? Having to do the manual measurements to be able to give status of where you're at, or just too much of everything, right? We shifted everything left, and now it's all in everyone's head and they can't get anything done, right? So it looks like we have onboarding of new services and developers is one of the big challenges here. Looks like it's settling down a little bit. Yeah, great. Yeah, we definitely, that aligns with what we hear talking to customers and prospects is, and folks out there is one of the big challenges is two things. You're either a new developer or an existing developer starting on a new team or project, and you got to dive in and figure out how to get it all set up and how to make sure your libraries are all right and how to figure out where the documentation is and how the different components and what they are and what are the usual standard things that get used. Or you're trying to create a new service, and there's a whole bunch of a run list that you need to go through to ask all the right people for all the right things to be created. And this bootstrapping, this onboarding period can really crunch our productivity and morale, actually, because when you get started with something, you're excited and you want to get going, right? So that leads to poor developer experience. And I wanted to throw up a few figures here just to kind of level set us, and this is from Stack Overflow survey a couple years ago, actually, and it's only gotten worse. But 40% at the time of the developers, and they surveyed thousands of developers, their time is being wasted on what we call toil, right? Toil is anything that you're doing that is not the innovative part, is not the designing, the developing, the coding, the architecting. It's when you have to waste time on setting up a server so you can actually do that work, or setting up a repo, or doing the TicketOps back and forth, trying to get someone's attention, or searching for documentation. So if we think about the amount of money that gets spent for, from a company perspective to have developers innovate and move the company forward, 40% regardless is a pretty high number to lose to unproductive work or unvaluable work. 48%, so almost 50%, the developers that were surveyed consider onboarding, and this is what we're seeing in the survey, basically takes just too long. Frustrated you can't get going, trying to figure out who to talk to, you're doing rumor-driven development, hopping from one person to the next to find out who owns something so you can get it set up. And then 45% of developers agree that they're waiting for answers to their questions, and it's disrupting their workflow, right? And as developers, we want to stay in the zone. We want to be able to get that time where we can actually get the work, and stay focused. And if you run into a problem where you don't know the answer and you have to go look for it and search for it and go talk to people, that takes you out of that flow. It takes time, and it also interrupts another person who has the answer. It's a little more recent survey that Harness did, State of Developer Experience, and that is actually a full report that you can get on the website. But this is looking at what is the toll, the human side of poor developer experience and productivity. And what we found, pretty shocking, right? 10 days on average is the average time that developers are working overtime each month. So out of 30 days, so a third of that time they're working overtime. More than 50%, 52% of developers are burning out, and that's why they're leaving their job. And that's really impactful, because if you think about that from a business perspective, it takes about, on average, 2 months to onboard a new developer if you don't have the right infrastructure and tools and everything set up that we're about to talk about. So you imagine you're burning out developers. They're working overtime, they're burning out, they're leaving, and then to bring a new person in to take over that role or get whatever innovation done needs to happen. It's 2 months before they're productive. That's pretty staggering. So this is what internal developer portals are meant to solve for. It's meant to reduce the cognitive load, automate the processes, make available the information that developers need in one place so that they, all of you, can just get the job done, can focus on the work, the innovation, and stay in the zone. Now, this is typically, has a service catalog, documentation, workflows, templates, scorecards for measuring how the software is doing. But I wanted to take a minute to make a point about this, because there's overlapping acronyms out there. IDP typically stands for Internal Developer Portal, which is what we're talking about. A portal is actually the interface to a whole system, a whole platform of tools that you probably use on a daily basis. Things like your CI/CD pipelines, your infrastructure provisioning, security and compliance checking, chaos management perhaps, feature flags or feature management and experimentation. There are many different parts of the underlying SDLC tool set that, when it sits on top of a platform, something that orchestrates them, is what the industry is starting to call an internal developer platform. So to not be confused there, that is really, that can be a central system that orchestrates and provides all of the pieces, or that can be your collection of best-in-class tools that you've put together. Either way, and maybe actually even especially when it's a bunch of different point tools put together, having an internal developer portal can bring it all together cohesively. And we'll talk about that more, but that's highly valuable because that's going to give you the ability to stay focused and to get the things you need right away. So the portal serves as the user's interface, the developer's interface to those underlying platform capabilities, and gives you access to all those different tools. We just talked about that, including the ability to do things like provision the needed infrastructure if you're set up that way, or quickly onboard an application. And that's what those service workflows are going to help with. And they're self-service workflows, which means they're set up intentionally with guided inputs so that you can get what you need and kick off needed work without having to go and be told, oh, well, you're not allowed to have that. Oh, you're not allowed to have that. Oh, you can't have that value. Or have to go check and see what a valid information, input is. Those are part of the workflow, and they abstract that platform complexity. The other thing that, as I mentioned, the developer portal does is it centralizes the knowledge about the technical documentation, the API specifications, the owners of a piece of software. How many times have you, said, hey, I want to inner source or look at and reuse a library that's part of our company's, collection of assets, and what the library is, but you run into a problem where you can't get it set up for some reason and you don't know who owns it. So then you're asking around, and I mentioned earlier rumor-driven development. You're trying to figure out, okay, who owns this, who owns this, who owns this, until you get closer and closer and waste a lot of time figuring out, the person that you can ask the question to so that you can get unstuck. So having all this kind of knowledge centralized, as well as the dependencies between all of the components, also helps to go a lot smoother. The other thing that it's going to do is it's going to keep best practices centralized as well. That shows up in multiple ways. One of those is in the workflows themselves. The best practices and standards can be baked into those workflows. So when you ask for example, a MongoDB being set up, you don't have to go look up what's the right way to do that, because it's going to do that automatically for you, as an example. And then the other thing that a good internal developer portal does is it's going to give you the visibility for each of the software components that are registered in the software catalog. It's going to tell you how its maturity level is, right? So you can set definitions, standards that say, in order for this to be production ready, we need to make sure that there's an on-call person assigned. And you can define the checks and roll those up into a scorecard that then is automatically collected and shown to you about every piece of software that the catalog knows about. So when you're working either and thinking about adopting someone or using someone else's piece of software or service, you can immediately know how healthy it is and how mature it is as far as its operational maturity and everything else, how secure it is. And it depends on what scorecards get set up. And then if you are actually the owner of one of these services, that information is right there as well, so that you can take action proactively on, if there's problems that are showing up or things that you're missing that's lowering the score, the health score of the or maturity score of the application that you own. So I just talked about a lot of different pieces, and there's as developers, in DevOps early on, we got onto this kick of like, hey, we can push things left, right? And the idea was supposed to be, pushing the time that we do things left, but instead what we ended up doing was pushing the responsibility left, and left meant to the developers. And so now as the developers, you own, setting up the infrastructure, setting up the security, doing the code, making sure that the networking is all right, doing all these things that are, they're needed, but they might be far more than any one developer has in their head how to do, right? And there's a lot of information that's part of a development process, documentation, the onboarding of different services and how you do it for cloud and infrastructure and whatnot. The pipelines themselves that actually bring the code and build it and package it and test it and get it all the way into production, hopefully eventually. Right, that's part of all. There's all these different pieces that has to be tracked and dealt with, and you have to know. And the idea here is this all goes into the developer portal, or is referenced by the developer portal in a central location. And that provides a lot of value to the developer. It makes onboarding accelerated. It gives a central place where all the data is, a single source of truth where we can search and look for this technical knowledge without having to go cut across, look in Jira and then go look in Confluence and then go look in the repo and look at all these different places. It's all centralized. We have those self-service workflows we're talking about that are going to automate all your day one, setup, and day two, regular operational workflows and tasks, so that you can move forward with those without having to wait for someone to take the ticket and then to work on it and pass it to someone else, etc. Is going to reduce the context switching because there's one place where you can look for all the data that you need. Improving the visibility, as I mentioned, with those scorecards, and giving you also with all the dependency information, because the software catalog has all of your services and software ideally registered in it. It also knows all of the dependencies between those. You put those in and it will draw the graph, and you can very easily see who depends on what, who's using you upstream and downstream. And that's very useful for understanding and exploring the software ecosystem that you operate in. And then all of this kind of comes together to really remove those blockers and that toil that breaks developer flow, which is ultimately what we want to have. Once you get into zone, we want you to stay there and be productive. There's also a pretty clear business value to all of this, and I wanted to touch on that for the folks watching who are looking at the business side of this. The faster developer onboarding is going to lower costs. The quicker service onboarding, again, that's going to increase your revenue, because it means that you can actually get new capabilities out to customers more quickly, because you can actually develop them more quickly. Eliminating that back and forth ticketing and reducing the manual process to get tasks done is going to lower costs. That's a higher efficiency way to operate. The standardization and governance by embedding best practices into the workflows, and in some tools that are available out there, you can apply policy, like policy as code as well. Harness is one of those, and that's going to lower risks. The ability to measure initiatives. So an initiative is when, for example, we say, there's a known vulnerability in this particular library. Every single piece of software we have or service we have running that has that piece of software, that library, we need to upgrade, and we need to know when it's done so that we can, sign off on the risk or know that we're clear, right? So how do you do that without a system that automatically collects and correlates that information? It's pretty manual. You have developers or managers reporting in using spreadsheets. It's a nightmare, and then somebody has to tabulate it. And so the ability to have a system automatically do that for you is going to lower your risks. And all of these also have other advantages, like that's going to lower your costs. You're going to have higher efficiency, right? Because your developers are going to be focused on developing code, not on collecting data about whether or not the library is upgraded. That reduced cognitive load is going to, by centralizing docs and giving simpler tool access, is going to lower costs again, because your developers can be more efficient. and more productive. And very important, and this is kind of where we started, right? Increasing the developer satisfaction is going to help to keep the developers working with you and make it easier to attract new talent as well. Developers know if you've got a bad reputation as a ancient or difficult environment to develop in, you're going to have a hard time hiring folks. So this is going to lower costs by increasing developer satisfaction because you're not going to have to work so hard and pay so much to get people in. So the big question then is build versus buy, right? So hopefully I've given you enough that you're either thinking about IDPs and now you're saying, yes, this makes sense, or you have one, or you're building one, and you're hearing things that either resonate with you and you're saying, yep, that's why we're doing it, or maybe there's some new things that we've talked about. So there's actually, I want to do another poll here, last one, promise, to kind of get a sense of where you are all at with respect to build versus buy and your progress with IDPs. Thanks for putting the poll up, Katie. So far, no one is doing anything. I'm guessing you're reading the answers. Here we go. Okay, we have quite a few folks researching options and some that are implementing. Great. And some of you have something, but are having some challenges with it. And these are all common states that we find folks in, and folks planning. Good. Okay. So it looks like the majority of you are researching developer portal options. So that's great. I hope you'll find this information useful, and or you are currently implementing. So that's great as well. Good. Great, thanks everyone for your participation in that. So let's get into it then. Build versus buy. So build is, for the most part, always means Backstage. And I'll talk about what Backstage is in just a minute. But it's kind of the 800-pound gorilla. It's open source. It was kind of the first developer portal out there, and it really lends itself because of its flexibility and scalability to being used for this. But the other option, and this is more and more prevalent, is that there are several commercial options available. Some are based on Backstage and some are not. And in full transparency, as you probably are aware, but I will point it out, I work for Harness. Harness has an internal developer portal product as well. And that is one of the things under my my purview. So yeah, you can check out our website and learn more about it, but I'm not going to focus specifically on that here. But there are a few places where I'm giving examples of a non-Backstage commercial or IDP solution, if you will. To my best of my ability, I'm talking generically about all of them that are out there. Sometimes it may be Harness specific, and I'll call it out when it is. So let's back up a little bit. What is Backstage? It's an open source framework for building internal developer portals. And I'm stressing that word because that's the key piece to understand. It is not an internal developer portal itself. It gives you the tools, the framework to build your own internal developer portal. It was created by Spotify in 2015 for themselves. Our product owner of our internal developer portal was actually one of the original developers on that team and worked with them for quite a while, and then decided that he wanted to take it further than where they want to take it. They're very focused on having it be a very valuable tool for their thousands and thousands of developers. And so they open sourced it, very generous, wonderful thing they did in 2020, gave it to the world, specifically the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, where it has risen and become an incubated project, so it is getting good traction. there's a great community of 10,000 plus platform engineers, developers, and everyone that uses it and enhances it, makes plugins for it, bug fixes it. So it is a very active community still. And it has strengths, absolutely. It's built for scale. It was proven at Spotify. They have 1,600 plus developers, 14,000 plus services that exist on their Spotify implementation of Backstage. Now, the open source version is not the same as the one that they have now internally enhanced. So, they've continued to build it out, and there are some things that are specific for them, as you would imagine with any framework that somebody takes to create something they're using. You would have you will have that. But another great strength is those open source credentials, right? CNCF project, active community we talked about. The plugin framework is well done. It integrates Backstage itself with over 200 tools using plugins that the community or different or company vendors themselves have written. So there's if you need to integrate into tools in your software development, your SDLC, very likely is there's a way to get that information into Backstage. And it is extremely strong at customizability. It's flexible UI, and the backend is very flexible as well, so you can define your own entities and all these things. And this is what's made it, as a framework, very popular, because people can bend it to do whatever they need it to. However, there are some challenges with Backstage, and I call it self-managed Backstage here because, for the most part, folks that run with Backstage are running it themselves in their data center and owning the management of the backend. The documentation is not great. It's fragmented, and you have to trial and error a lot of things. There's kind of docs by code. Code is documentation, mentality for many pieces of it. The operational complexity, Backstage is kind of known. It's a time-intensive thing to set up and configure and keep running, and part of that is because the way it's designed, it requires your folks to be experts and understand the architecture and understand how the plugins work in order to customize it and to keep it running. It does not have native scorecards. That piece we talked about, that's automatically checking on everything and giving you a roll-up of how healthy your software is. There are plugins for that that somebody else owns and moves forward at their own pace. But there's no native way of doing this, and that integrates in the data with all of the the user base and everything that's in there, and the software that's there. And so it's harder to do to track service alignment and standards. Believe it or not, there's no user interface, like UI, visual user interface. It is for the admins. For admins, pretty much if you want to configure or change or enhance it, it's direct coding. It has an automation capability, in a sense, to be able to take a template and open a repo and set up your application that you want to work on, or your service. But this is a very limited automation capability. It's called Scaffolder. It lacks the flexibility of complex automation. The ability to do things like call out to infrastructure, or configure, or to do approvals, and all sorts of other capabilities that are really needed to have strong workflow capability to really automate away a lot of the tasks that need to be done. And it has limited enterprise features. It was originally created for inside Spotify. Now they have put in the capability for themselves, but the open source version does not have this. They sell these as plugins, it's some of them, but it's missing things like governance, access controls, scalability, auditability. You can't apply policy across all of it. Policy as code, for example. So some challenges. So you get, if you need the flexibility, great, but there's some challenges you got to deal with. Some other things to consider. and I'm going to, just in the interest of time, make sure I'll go through these a little bit fast, but these slides I believe will be available to you, so with the video. When you're looking at these two things, consider the implementation timeline. How soon do you need the IDP to be in place, right? Is this a project where you can take 3, 6 or more months to get the framework to a point where it actually starts resembling the IDP you want and then start onboarding folks? Or is this something, hey, we need everyone on ASAP? I had a customer that needed to, they were going for the scorecards because they needed to prove FIPS compliant across all of their services. And they had a very short amount of time to do it, or they would have been penalized by their client. And so the only way to do that was to put IDP in place and have it do the collection and correlation and give all that information to them. And it worked great. Could imagine if they say, okay, we're going to sit down with this framework and we're going to start building, we're going to figure out what an IDP should look like. And we're going to build that part, and then we'll try and solve the problem we need to solve. Budget constraints, right? What is your budget? Is upfront and ongoing costs, right? If to get going with something where you're building from a framework, you're going to need to put in the development time, and that means FTEs or part-time employees. That means folks working on it, and that can be a very big upfront cost. And then there's of course the maintenance that goes forward with that as well. And I'm gonna, when you talk about the buy solutions, the vendors are oftentimes taking care of the implementation, taking care of the maintenance and all of that. And so you can get up and running quick, and price-wise, it's a lot more stable. You need to be considering your specific developer needs, right? Are there unique needs? I mean, we have run across some folks where they need to plug into very many different systems in certain ways. And for them, the thing that made the most sense at the time was to go from the framework and build up, because they wanted a very unique thing. So that's something that needs to be considered. What are your organization's requirements? The maintenance capabilities. Do you have, if you're gonna own it, if you're gonna self-manage Backstage as your IDP, do you have the capacity to maintain a custom solution and and keep it updated and make sure that your changes or your customizations live past the updates? Again, as a vendor, that's something that IDP vendors provide. What's your growth forecast? What's your scaling look like? IDP can, Backstage can scale, but it does take some work to get it there. There are very specific things that the open source version of Backstage is just not able to really to scale with without a lot of work being done to adapt it. Things like having hierarchical and multiple ways to address and find information and do the RBAC on that. And so that's something that you have to consider when you're thinking about how you expect this to scale. And then those enterprise requirements, again, I actually just mentioned RBAC, but there are other enterprise grade capabilities as well, like governance and auditability, that you need to consider. Because if it's not in the framework, you'll have to put it in or find it or buy it or integrate it, as opposed to a solution which might have it. Okay, so let's take a quick look at Backstage versus, again, because that's really kind of the gorilla, the 800-pound gorilla, the largest percentage of build versus what we'll call an IDP solution or a buy. Okay, think about, for example, roadmaps, right? In the Backstage sense, this is a community-run thing. You can get slow feature uptake and adoption, but it's wildly flexible, right? You can do anything. It might take some time to get it accepted. On the other side, when you're working with a buy situation, you're working with the vendor who is customer centric, and a good vendor is going to not have just sold you something, they're going to be a partner, right? And so you have direct access to talk and work with the people that are directly affecting the capabilities of that product, of that IDP. From an enhancements perspective, again, same kind of idea, is how fast can you do enhancements that you need. If it's community driven, if it's Backstage or the build situation, you're going to be doing coding. So you're going to need coders that know your setup and know Backstage in order to make those changes that you want. As opposed to with the vendor, a buy situation, there are low code options available, but you also have the vendor as dedicated resources to enhance the product. Documentation, we talked about dedicated team versus the sparse documentation. That is, when one of the developers in the open source project decides they want to document, and there's a lot of code as documentation in this. The UI is in Backstage highly customizable, but you get a minimum out of the box smoothness and capability, whereas with the vendors you have polished out of the box customized options, or with customization options as well. So they've not lost the customizability, maybe not quite as customizable, but a much better fluid interface that makes sense and is more modern. The stability of the project. So Backstage is releasing monthly, and you have to upgrade, occasionally here. That's going to potentially affect your changes and your additions, and needs to be tested and validated. With an IDP solution, those are validated regularly through their QA group, right? So it's not something that you, as an owner of this IDP, has to do, or the user of it. Decision making, it's really, and we've seen this more and more now, Spotify is still really driving this to where they need it to go. So it's a Spotify dominated community. Those are the majority of the folks making the calls on it still. Whereas with a buy situation, a vendor, you have customer, you are a customer, and so where it goes and what decisions are made are feedback driven. Again, with a good vendor. Within that plugin ecosystem, there are 200 plus, probably more at this point, plugins for Backstage to integrate with all those different SDLC tools, but not all of them work and not all of them are secure. The marketplaces for vendors such as Harness are, we curate them and you have access to them, and if you want one that's not curated, then we do that. But we're doing the validation, making sure it works, doing the security checks on it. So you can know that if you're taking one of those plugins out of the marketplace, in this case, the Harness IDP marketplace, that it's been vetted. I'm not going to go through the details of this, but another thing you have to think about is what's the cost estimate for building it, because again, Backstage is a framework. I keep saying that, but when you start with it, you then need to build it up to what you need. So here's a rough estimate we did based on what we've heard and what we know it takes to build these different parts, things like granular RBAC system, user management, different capabilities in the software catalog like tech docs, the workflow capability, which should be more sophisticated than what Backstage originally provides, working with the plugin framework, building plugins, the scorecard piece. All of this takes, you either are getting when you buy a vendor package, or you're going to need to create it or buy it from in piecemeal from somewhere. And so rough estimate, and again, this is, some places of the world it'll be cheaper, but this is assuming, an annualized cost of a developer. It can get pretty pricey to get to the point where Backstage is equal to what you can get from a buy situation. Other things to consider when you're building is you have to take people that you have, FTEs, and have them work on that, or you need to hire new people. So you have to absorb that workload somehow. This can risk, implementation of other things, or having the implementation of Backstage itself getting delayed can also slow down everything else because maybe you have a dependency that you need on it. So velocity overall is just at higher risk. There's just generally the opportunity cost of the engineer because they have to build and maintain this. Now you've added another thing that has to be maintained going forward so that your system, your SDLC, your developers can work. Again, rough numbers rounded up, looking across different groups and folks we talked to. The maintenance cost, I just mentioning, right? Monthly upgrades, incident recovery when something goes wrong, keeping up those framework changes, security updates, so, user management, all these things. A lot of that with purchased solutions are built in, but a lot of those are things that you have to create or do more manually with the open source Backstage. And so big difference in how many days per month or time, how much time you need to spend to keep that up and running. And then in general, when we look at, many companies that are using Backstage, and I have to be careful. Backstage has its place where it's very valuable and very capable, and it's done an amazing thing to get everyone to where we are. It's like the early days when running a CI/CD pipeline was for the unicorns, right? What we're trying to do is we're trying to get this so that everybody can take advantage of what an internal developer portal can bring. And Backstage is a pioneer in doing that. However, we can see things like Spotify's Backstage org itself, 50 employees, 30 of which are developers, focus solely on keeping Backstage running. Granted, that's for 1,400 developers. We've got customers that have far more than that, twice that easily. Netflix's core team, 10 engineers to keep it running. Expedia, 15 engineers and 2 product managers, because we'll talk about that, how you should think about this when you're owning it. American Airlines, 15 plus engineers, Capital One, 20 plus engineers to get something done in 18 months. So rough estimate, it's almost not worth it below 200 developers because of the amount of work and effort you have to put in. And it goes up from there, right? 15 plus, we're seeing groups that have, 3,000 plus, developers using the product, and they need to have a whole separate team. And that's what we're seeing here. Whereas with the vendor solution, again, this is going to vary per vendor. You could be looking at 1 to 2 FTEs and maybe up to 3 to 4 once you start hitting these upper bounds, or not bounds, but these upper numbers. So let's step back. There are times where it makes sense to start with Backstage, and there are times it makes sense to look at buying instead of building. So let's look at this piece of it first, which is, when does it make sense to build? And again, we'll assume that means on Backstage, because Backstage does bring a lot to the table. You can imagine without all the framework and all the capability it does bring, if you were going to build from scratch, it would probably be even more challenging. So unique requirements. For example, needing highly specialized integrations in a way that the system is going to work and communicate with your internal systems. This is an area where it might make more sense to go with Backstage because you might not get that level of depth in architectural flexibility from a vendor. Full control is desired. So if your organization is of the sort where you want the destiny, your destiny in your hands, and you don't believe that a vendor can, or a purchased solution can do that for you at the level that you need, and you want to be able to customize and change architecture and features, it's sort of like the same as this first bullet point. This might be the way for you to go. If you don't have the available engineering if you do have the available engineering resources, like, I don't know, if I ask for a raise of hands, how many people have too many engineers, right? And not enough to do. But if you do have that situation, or funding and want to focus on this, great. Then this might be a way to go if those other things, the other 2 bullets are in place and it's needed. But keep in mind, it's not just the 6 months of developing, turning the framework into an IDP. It's also the maintenance going forward. And then if you think about your, consider the long-term, budget approach, and you say, hey, okay, I understand that I'm going to spend a whole bunch to get this project in place, and I'm prepared to pay for the maintenance going forward because it makes sense for me, perhaps because of these other, these other bullet points. Then, yeah, maybe it's worth digging in there. On the other hand, when does it make sense to consider, at least look at buying an IDP solution, something that is commercial or vendor based? If you need a quick implementation, like the customer I mentioned who needed to, I think they had, I think it was 2 or 3 months that they needed to get this wrapped up. They tried it the hard way, it didn't work. And so we needed to get them rolling very fast. There was no way that it made sense for them to sit down with Backstage and start from scratch and build an IDP. So faster time to value. If you have limited engineering resources, or you don't want to take your engineering resources and have them work on this project, building out an IDP, if you want just the tool to do the job so your engineers can do their job, which is innovate, and make the change the business needs, then buying an IDP might make more sense. I mentioned this a little bit before, cost predictability, right? If you're hiring FTEs or moving engineers over to work on building out an IDP on your own, you might run into problems or find that there's a scale issue or something where you need to suddenly pull in more folks, and your cost predictability is variable. Most of the vendors that you would buy from are subscription based, and so you have predictable expenses. You get the vendor support that I mentioned. You're going to be able to leverage the best practices that the vendor has learned over working with hundreds of organizations. And in fairness, you potentially have that baked into some parts of Backstage as well. But again, it's not an IDP, it's a framework. So you may not see that come through. And then again, those enterprise capabilities. If you need those enterprise capabilities, building out really solid RBAC and advanced security, governance and scalability is that really where you want to spend your time? So just wrapping here, a few more slides, I promise. One of the things I mentioned we talk about is the adoption. How do you get adoption? There's kind of two mindsets you can take that are going to really affect your success in this. And we've seen this play out again and again working with customers, right? You can take a platform first angle, which is kind of saying, hey, our goal is to set up an internal developer portal. We want the platform. You might hear things like, we need a software catalog, or we need scorecards to measure service maturity, or we need workflows to standardize our service onboarding. None of that is wrong. Those are absolute valid needs. However, the other way to think of this is from a developer first perspective, where the goal then is to improve developer effectiveness, because that's what developer portals are created for, and that's what they're designed for. That is really what they're on this earth to do. And so if you approach this from the perspective of, what does the customer need, right? In this case, the developer is the customer. And this, I don't have this on the slide, but this notion of product versus project, right? You should treat this as a product. You should, as I mentioned, some teams have PMs, product managers, that look at this and say, okay, the developers are my customers. What do they need? Prioritize those, just like a vendor would, and like we do for the features and capabilities. The same way when you're getting adoption, when you're implementing and deploying, you need to think of it the same way as well. And so from a developer first perspective, you'll be asking questions or thinking things such as, my devs are having issues with discoverability. I need to solve that. Or the service and the developer onboarding is taking too long. I need to solve that. Right? These are the problems that the developers have, or the areas where they need help. The devs are finding it too hard to keep up with the standards. How do I fix that problem, right? Not about the platform, it's about the customer, the developer. So clearly that's a recommended way to look at this. And I'm going to put this up just because I think there's a natural flow that happens if you look at Backstage. As I mentioned, it's a framework. So you have to start by thinking, okay, what is the IDP that we need to build? Our platform engineers are building a developer portal, as opposed to commercial or IDP solution. You can go right into how are the developers deriving daily utility out of the solution. You don't have to worry about building it. You can focus on getting value out of it. So that's it. We're going to switch to Q&A in a minute. As I mentioned, my name is Dan Gordon. Happy to talk with any of you further about this. I work at Harness. We do have a internal developer portal that is based off of Backstage that we've extended, added scorecards to, as you can see, redone the UI so that it's much more usable and it has all of the enterprise features and capabilities based off of the Harness platform, which has been one of the leading CI/CD and DevOps platforms for quite some time. And this is a great addition because it wraps up nicely all the capabilities around those capabilities and any of your tools into a very powerful and great way for developers to get what they need. So again, I think there's been some pop-ups along the way. There's one. There's an ebook that we have that goes into more depth on what we just covered. Check that out. We'll switch to Q&A.
Thanks so much, Dan. We do have a couple of questions over in the Q&A, so I'm going to go ahead and rapid fire some at you right now. Are you ready?
Yep, let's go.
Excellent, excellent. So we have one question that's come in that says, can the portal also orchestrate many of the best-in-class tools as part of the platform APIs and integration layer? This one came in a little early, so I am wondering if maybe you perhaps talked about that at one point, but I think it's good to repeat it.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I can go into more depth on that. So yes, it does. So one of the things that's really important, we think, and that sets aside some portals from others, is the level to which they can do automation and integration of the different tools. There is one level of integration that is what you hear about with the Backstage plugins, which is pulling in visual information, pulling in data so it can be represented centrally. But the other piece of that is when you run a workflow. With something like Scaffolder, you have very limited automation that you can do, running scripts and a few things, maybe calling an external tool that can do actually pipelining. And so with something like Harness IDP, we're basing off of the Harness pipeline technology, which is enterprise class, sophisticated. You want to be able to do things like run in parallel, have advanced approvals, flow, being able to set failure mode and behaviors. So all of these things, and integrate out to all those other tools on an API basis. So you're not just pulling data, but you're also interacting with them. And so because the pipeline, again, in the Harness IDP is based off of the drone pipeline. I don't know if you're familiar with Drone, but this says, again, it was a community open source CI tool that we had and has hundreds of integrations, active integrations that you can use as part of it. So you can automate anything, basically.
Excellent. Well, we have another one that's come in that says, what types of automations provide the most immediate value when implementing IDP? So we're talking about, we can automate anything, but if we were to immediately identify that value, what are those?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. There's a few, and the answer really is it depends. And what I mean by that is you have to look at your developer community and find out where they're getting stuck. If you solve that, that's the most valuable thing, right? However, a trend that we do see is that day two things, I need access to the logs on this system for an hour, right? Or I need a database, a MongoDB set up, or I need to add my login or get added to to this system so I can have access to work with it, or I need a new piece of infrastructure set up, or so these types of things where normally they would have to put in a ticket, wait for it to get handed to the right person in the IT org, and do this back and forth, and then the developer's waiting and they're falling out of the zone. Those are pretty valuable to automate. We have several clients that's all they're using the IDP for, out of the gate, and just have wild adoption because it's like the easy button, right? But again, I'll go back to that. You can go in with that notion, but the first thing you got to do is find out where your developers are getting stuck.
Very good. I've got one here that I'm interested to know. Can you share some real world examples of how scorecards have improved, there it is, have improved governance and standardization?
Yeah, no, absolutely. One of the ones I gave an example of actually during the presentation was, and I won't give the name, but a company that needed to make sure that they were FIPS compliant so that they could get their FedRAMP. And they had to do this in a small amount of time. They did the first pass trying to do it manually, or with the systems they had in place, couldn't do it. What we did when we started working with them was we set up scorecards, because one of the things the scorecards can do is it can look over all of the software and give you a full listing of here's where everything is at, which means you can see the trends, like the constantly updated trends of, did every one of your 200 or 1,000 or whatever it is pieces of software and services upgrade this version of of this library to this past this version, right? Which means that nobody has to do all the manual collection work. It's just there. We've also seen that come in with another customer who was getting their applications deployed and built and tested, and then deploying them to production, and then having a pretty high failure rate in production. And so putting scorecards in place where they're looking at, is the security set up properly? Is the application production ready, right? Looking at the right checks that tell them that, give the developers that own the service an immediate feedback right away, where they fall on that range, right? Oh, I don't have an on-call person in place, or oh, I haven't added this, this capability that's necessary for checkpoint. Whatever it is, then they can take action and fix it before they send it out, before it gets missed. Because not everything is tested by SAST and DAST and all of the rest of our and functional testing, right? Some of it is is deep, is like, is our SCM set up properly so that we're not doing the wrong thing. So.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you everyone for your questions. We are out of time at the moment, but we will do our best to make sure we get back to you and get those answers to you. Of course, you can learn more over on Harness's website. I'm sure Dan will be there to answer more questions as they come in. But thank you so much for your time today. Thank you to Dan. Thank you to Harness. Once again, I'm Katie Bavoso, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.